Night fell thickly over Dunrath, a village forgotten by time, where the wind seemed to whisper secrets long buried. The dense fog covering the streets was almost a living entity, embracing each stone and wooden building as if protecting something. It was there, among the ancient oaks and the Gothic ruins of the abandoned monastery, that young people began to mysteriously disappear over the years. The local authorities, unprepared, never came up with a plausible explanation, only whispered. Rumors among the oldest villagers. Caitlin, a 31-year-old nurse recently arrived in the village, was the first to notice something strange on a cold winter night. Returning home after an exhausting shift at the regional hospital, she felt the invisible eyes of the forest watching her. As she passed through the woods, she heard an agonizing cry coming from between the trees, a sound as human as it was disturbing, but filled with a pain and despair that surpassed anything natural. She stopped, tempted to flee, but something held her in place. A black shadow, taller than a man, emerged between the trunks, its blazing eyes reflecting an ancient and cruel hunger. Caitlin tried to run, but stumbled, feeling the bitter cold of the wet ground. In the next instant, a scream shattered the silence of the night, and she vanished without a trace. In the days that followed, Caitlin's disappearance triggered a deep fear throughout the village. Other residents began reporting shadowy presences, objects moving by themselves, and voices whispering their names in the stillest hours. Fear soon turned to panic when the mutilated body of a local hunter, Alan, 45, was found near the forest, bearing strange marks on his skin and his heart torn from his chest. There was no clue to indicate who or what had committed the crime. The police were astonished and helpless. For weeks, Dunrath sank into a heavy, terrifying silence until, one night, a meeting was called at the old church. Desperate, the villagers decided to seek help from ancient local legends, whispered stories about an ancestral being imprisoned in the ruins of the monastery, whose hunger could only be sated by human suffering. Many doubted, but fear was stronger than reason. The village was gripped by an invisible, powerful evil, and the clock of death kept ticking. As Dunrath's frozen nights marched on, the terror seemed to grow stronger and take shape, as if the darkness was feeding on the villagers' fear. The disappearance of Caitlin and the brutal death of Alan were only the beginning of a series of horrors no one could have predicted. That ancient being, said in the stories to be trapped in the monastery's ruins, seemed to be gaining more power, slowly freeing itself from the invisible prison that had held it for centuries. Thomas, a 38-year-old local history teacher, began obsessively investigating the region's legends, scouring old documents and talking to the elders. He discovered that the entity, called the Reaper of Shadows, was a vengeful spirit that had been imprisoned after a dark ritual performed by monks in the 12th century. They said the monster fed on the souls of its victims, leaving their bodies utterly disfigured and marked with grotesque symbols before vanishing them into the darkness of the forest. That same night, as the village seemed to sleep under a heavy shroud of fear, the worst happened. Sarah, a 29-year-old librarian who had always been skeptical about supernatural stories, felt a sudden, sharp chill as she locked up the library. The air around her thickened, as if something invisible was closing in. She heard slow, dragging footsteps coming down the dark hallway. Trying to stay calm, Sarah hurried outside, but a muffled scream cut the silence, the last she would ever utter before disappearing into a ghostly glow and utter silence. The next day, her body was found in the forest, grotesquely mutilated, the skin torn from parts of her body and strange symbols carved into her chest. The village was paralyzed. Thomas, now certain of what they were up against, tried to alert regional authorities, but met only disbelief and disregard. Tension in the village grew, and the darkness seemed tangible, taking hold of every heart. The stories began to circulate on local social networks, gaining attention and terrifying accounts from others who felt the presence of the Reaper. Some residents, overwhelmed by fear and guilt, started disappearing without explanation, leaving behind only torn clothes and marks on the ground resembling gigantic footprints, as if something monstrous had walked through. And this is where I want to ask you to do something different. If this story has already sent chills down your spine or captivated you, tell me in the comments which scene affected you the most so far. It could be a detail, a word, something that left you uneasy. I want to see if we can feel together this atmosphere of fear that haunts Dunrath. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because only then can I bring you more stories as intense and heavy as this one, with the quality you deserve. Let's explore these terrors together and keep this community alive and strong. But hold on, because the worst is yet to come. The grey sky over Dunrath seemed to press down on every resident's shoulders as the presence of the Reaper of Shadows became more visible and terrifying. Now consumed by obsession, Thomas decided to go to the ruins of the old monastery, believing he might find some way to stop the entity. Armed with candles, protective symbols, and an ancient grimoire he had found in the library, he entered the cold, silent darkness of the age-old stones, feeling the air grow colder and more suffocating with each step. Inside the monastery, he found inscriptions that seemed to describe a containment ritual, but which had long been broken. In the center, a crypt hid a macabre altar covered with bones and dried bloodstains. It was there that Thomas felt a presence that defied any human logic. The Reaper appeared, a dark silhouette with blazing red eyes and a smile that seemed to rend the soul. The confrontation was brutal. Thomas managed to recite a few words of the ritual, but the price was steep. He felt his strength drain away, his vision blur, and a horrid scream escaped his throat as the creature's claws tore into him. Meanwhile, things in the village grew worse. Disappearances increased, and no one dared step out after sunset. In the community center, the few survivors began organizing vigils and seeking help in prayers and amulets, but nothing seemed capable of stopping the rising tide of horror. One night, as a violent storm lashed the area, the group was attacked by something beyond description. A gigantic shadow materialized among them, dragging people into an invisible abyss. The violence of the attack left indelible scars on the village and in the minds of the survivors. One of them, Agnes, a 34-year-old nurse who had lost her brother in the first disappearance, described in a trembling voice how she narrowly escaped, leaving behind a friend who was taken with no hope of return. Agnes now bore a pain that outweighed her fear, a mix of guilt, despair, and anger that made her want to fight the evil to the end. At this point, you who are following the story might ask yourself, if it happened here, in my town, on my street, what would I do to face something like this? If you've ever had a strange experience or know someone who's gone through something similar, share it in the comments. I truly want to hear from you, because stories like this gain strength when we share our fears and face them together. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss the following chapters of this terrifying saga, because what comes next will test everything you think you know about fear and survival. After the dreadful stormy night, Dunrath was unrecognizable. Deserted streets, abandoned houses, and a sepulchral silence that seemed to announce the end of the village. Thomas, exhausted and nearly powerless, returned from the monastery with a fragment of the grimoire, where he found a final warning in an ancient language stating that the only way to stop the Reaper of Shadows would be a voluntary sacrifice, someone who offered their own essence to lock the creature on the threshold between the worlds of the living and the dead. But who would have the courage for such a thing? Who would accept becoming the price for the other's salvation? While Thomas wrestled with despair, Agnes joined him, determined to put an end to the nightmare. Together, They scoured local legends, spoke with the village elders, and gathered what was left of the community, who gradually clustered in a single place, the old church, protected by sacred symbols and burning candles. That night, under the full moon lighting the cloudy sky, the Reaper appeared one last time, more voracious and brutal than ever. The entire village witnessed the spectral figure advancing on those who tried to resist. Lives were mercilessly taken. The sound of screams mingled with wind and rain, creating a macabre symphony that would seal Dunrath's fate. Then Agnes made her decision. Knowing the alternative was total extinction, she offered herself as the sacrifice. Thomas tried to dissuade her, but she was resolute, believing that only such a gift could save the few who were left alive. The ritual began with the grimoire's words recited in unison as Agnes stepped into the center of the circle formed by the community. The creature seemed to hesitate, as if recognizing the act of courage and nearly accepting the deal. When the last verse was spoken, a blinding light filled the space, a light that burned the shadows and seemed to rip the fabric of reality itself. Agnes disappeared in the glare, and the Reaper dissolved into a whisper, leaving behind absolute silence. The following day, the village was changed. The fog that once shrouded the streets was gone, the air tasted lighter, and people began slowly returning to their homes, still in shock, but with renewed hope. Yet something strange remained. In Thomas's eyes, Agnes remained present, like an eternal shadow at his side, a reminder of the price paid for their salvation. This story makes us wonder how far someone will go to protect those they love, and how much fear can change the choices we make. If you've enjoyed it so far, share your opinion. What was the most shocking moment for you? Have you ever felt something you couldn't explain? I want to know. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you can keep exploring these mysteries that challenge our understanding. Time passed and Dunrath, despite its deep scars, began to rebuild. The village's stories, once ignored, became legends passed on through generations, a warning about the hidden dangers lurking in places forgotten by time. Thomas went on guarding the fragment of the grimoire, aware that Agnes's sacrifice did not guarantee the evil was completely gone. On silent nights, he still sensed a distant whisper calling to him, a reminder that the Reaper of Shadows might one day return. Meanwhile, the survivors carried a visceral fear, a shadow in their eyes that never fully faded. The village was never the same, and the young born after that night never heard the storm's screams, but inherited the fear and respect for the darkness that sometimes seems to awaken. In the end, Dunrath became a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness, and most importantly, a reminder that there are forces that transcend our understanding and that courage is not always enough to avoid the worst. But what about you? After hearing this story, what would you take with you for your life? Have you ever had an experience that made you question what lies beyond our world? Tell the community here in the comments. Let's create a space where fear turns into wisdom and courage. And if you're not yet part of this journey, be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us in exploring the darkest side of human existence. Your story might be the next account that stirs us and brings light to the shadows. Thank you so much for being with us until now. Your presence and participation make all the difference. See you in the next video where terror and mystery remain alive in a way that only we know how to tell.